Welcome everyone. This is a friendly reminder that my name is Elena. I work for Nuffic NATO Russia. We are the organizer of the Dutch Science Talks project. And this project is a series of guest lectures, which are organized in close collaboration with the Embassy of the Netherlands in Moscow. So the topic of today's lecture, as you can see and on the screen, is Darwin comes to town. So we will talk about evolution today. And we are very happy to welcome our guest here, Menno Schilthuizen, who is a professor of evolution and biodiversity at Leiden University in the Netherlands and a researcher at Naturalis Biodiversity Center here. Sorry, there. He's also an active science communicator, and he has written more than 200 articles about ecology and evolution for magazines and newspapers. He's also a TED speaker, and we are very honored to have him here today. Here is a friendly reminder for those of you who haven't noticed. He is an author of Darwin Comes to Town book, which was also translated in Russian. You can see it in the screens right now. I'm showing it to you. Please buy it. This is not an advertisement, but I read it myself and it's amazing. So please do it. Okay, so as I said, we are talking about urban evolution today, and Menno, the floor is yours. I will turn off my camera and sound. Meanwhile, you can write your questions in the chat, or better, in the Q&A function right here. So basically, if you're sitting on your PC, there is a Q&A mode here. You can answer your questions there. And if you have any questions about the connection or something else, please write them in the chat. So Menno, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, and also thanks to you and also to Jerke for inviting me on this wonderful program of Dutch Science Talks organized by the Netherlands Embassy in Moscow. It's a great honor to be here. It's also very appropriate, as you mentioned, because my book Darwin Comes to Town was recently translated into Russian. So it's a great opportunity to meet my Russian audience in a different way. So yes, as you mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist and an ecologist. I'm also quite active as a science communicator. So I give lectures like this one, and I write popular science books. And I also organize expeditions and excursions for non-biologists or with non-biologists and biologists combined. But today I'd like to take you into the urban jungle and to tell you about how evolution influences the wild animals and plants that we find in our cities all over the world. And we're going to start, surprisingly, not in a city, but in the inside of an ant's nest. So what you see here is the inside of an ant's nest in the laboratory. And you see a couple of worker ants moving around, but you also see one beetle. The organism on the bottom left hand of the screen is not an ant, it's a beetle. And this is a so-called myrmecophile. It's a beetle that has evolved the ability to speak ant. And speaking ant is something that happens in a chemical way. Ants use chemicals to communicate with each other, and these beetles have evolved the ability to use the exact same chemicals that the ants use. And what's happening in the bottom left corner is that this beetle is telling in a chemical way to this ant, hey, I'm also a worker ant and I'm hungry, please feed me. And the worker ant complies because it doesn't know any better than this beetle is speaking the truth, because it is using the right language. Now, this is not the only myrmecophile that we know of. In fact, myrmecophiles are usually small invertebrate animals that have evolved the ability to find a niche inside an ant's nest. And there are literally thousands of species worldwide of beetles, but also snails, millipedes, mites, caterpillars, a whole range of small organisms that have evolved the ability to spend their entire lives inside an ant's nest, and usually the nest of a specific species of ant. And what they do there is sometimes, they use some sort of form of social parasitism like this beetle does. to trick the ants into feeding them. But some other species, they eat eggs of the ants, or they chase the larvae, or they even eat the adults of the eggs, or they are very, very harmless, and they feed on the detritus, the remains of the food of the ants. Now, the reason that there are so many of these myrmecophiles in the world, so many of these animals that live inside ants' nests, is that ants, and also, for example, termites, are what we call ecosystem engineers. They are animals that have the ability to modify their environment in such a way that new niches appear for other species. New ways of life become available for other species that are not ants. And if you look at this picture, you can imagine why that is. This is actually a deserted nest of a leafcutter ant, which in South America, which has been filled up with cement by researchers and is now being excavated for a museum display. But you can see how large this nest is. Literally tens of millions of individuals live in this ant city, with various compartments and divisions of labor. But to keep this ant city running, these ants need to harvest food and other resources in the wide environment of the ants nest. So in fact, the ant colony is not just what we see in this picture, but it extends its influence into a much larger area around the nest, where these ants are harvesting materials that they need to keep this nest running. So in the nest, you find a concentration of food and other resources harvested by the ants from the environment, which makes these nests a very energy-rich place, which of course is interesting for other species to start making use of. Now, for millions of years, ants and termites were the world's most important ecosystem engineers, but in the past few thousand years, they have been upstaged by us. We humans are now the world's most important ecosystem engineers. We do exactly the same thing that ants have been doing for millions of years. We build colonies, cities, in which we live with millions or tens of millions of people together. And to keep those colonies running, to keep those cities running, we harvest food and other materials in the wide environment around the city. So the cities are places where there's a high concentration of food and other useful materials that other species, like in the ant's nest, other species could start making use of. And for a long time, urbanization, so building cities, was something that was the exception in the world. You would have large areas of natural, more or less natural environment, and here and there a small city. But in the past few decades and into the next few decades, and this video shows that, cities with more than 1 million inhabitants have been expanding rapidly, and they will continue to expand, as far as we know, into the future. So especially in Asia and Africa, urbanization is going to increase exponentially. For example, that blue blob that you see on the east coast of Pearl River Delta in China, where you have 120 million people that are living in an area that is the size of Belgium, and that area is completely urbanized. So, and that's a population that is not much smaller than the population of Russia. So you have areas in the world now that are the size of a country, which are completely urbanized. So it's understandable that for the other species that we share this world with, urbanization is really something that they have to reckon with. It is something that they cannot ignore anymore. And cities are full of opportunities, just like ants' nests are full of opportunities. So are cities, so are human cities. For example, this coot, this water bird, which has found a particularly stable nesting opportunity in a canal in Rotterdam. in an upturned shopping trolley, or this urban fox in London, which has discovered a new food source in winter. And especially if you think of mammals which can use their forepaws as hands like we do, they of course are particularly suited to move around the city and to make use of it. And you can, in the tropics, these are other primates like monkeys, but in North America and also in parts of Europe nowadays, raccoons are a very good example, and this video shows that. And it's not just about food or nesting opportunities. You could also think of properties of the materials that we use in cities. Think of, for example, of woodpeckers, which in spring they make this drum roll on trees to defend a territory. And normally woodpeckers amplify that sound by making use of hollow trees or of loose bark, which can act as a soundboard for their drum roll. But recently, woodpeckers have started discovering that some human materials have even better acoustic properties. So this little video shows a woodpecker that has discovered that a lamppost can amplify its drum roll perfectly. You'll notice that the picture is behind the sound, but I think you get the message. Yeah. And it's not just animals that benefit from cities. You can also think of certain plants, such as this one. This plant is Danish scurvy grass. It's a plant that you can find all over Northern Europe, growing along roads and streets. And if you had seen a distribution map of this plant species for the 19th century, you would have seen only the coastlines, because this is a beach plant. It grows only very close to the sea because it only grows on salty soil. But since we have been using salt to de-ice the roads in the winter, there's permanently in Northern Europe a strip of salty soil present along all the major roads, which is salty enough for these beach plants to grow. So if you now see a distribution map of this plant species, you still see the coastline, but you also see the entire highway network of Northern Europe. So thanks to us, this plant has been able to expand its distribution area tremendously. So there are benefits to living in the city, to living with us ecosystem engineers. But there are also dangers. There's also challenges to living in cities or close to cities. An example is this Australian jewel beetle. This is a beetle which in this picture is sitting on a beer bottle, a so-called stubby. And if stubbies were a type of beer bottle that had been used for a long time by Australian beer brewers to bottle various brands of beer, but if you look closely, you'll see that the beetle is not just sitting on this bottle, it is trying to mate with this bottle. This is a male jewel beetle, and it turns out that these stubbies, which are thrown, by car drivers out of the window everywhere, so the roadside verges are littered with, or were littered with, these stubby bottles. In the mating season, these beetles were throwing themselves en masse on these bottles because it turns out that they have the exact right curvature and gloss, and especially those dimples that are pressed in the glass that make these bottles appear like very large, super sexy female jewel beetles. So as I said, in the mating season, you find these male beetles throwing themselves by the hundreds on these bottles, completely ignoring the perfectly fine female jewel beetles that were waiting for them in the bushes. And the species would have gone extinct because, of course, these bottles are super sexy, but also super unfertile. If it weren't for the fact that because of this discovery, the Australian beer brewers decided to change the design of their bottles and reduce the sex appeal so that the species could be saved. But this is just one of the examples of the many challenges that are unexpected, which the city poses. So in a way, the city is an extreme environment. Just like other extreme environments in the world, you can think of deserts or hot water springs. Cities offer opportunities. There is food there, there are opportunities there, but to be able as an animal or plant to make use of those opportunities, you're faced with very unusual challenges, very unusual demands that the city places on animals and plants that want to live in this city. And what exactly are those challenges and opportunities? Well, you can classify them into four major categories. The first one is simply the physics of the city. The physical structure of the city is very different from natural environments. For example, we have something called the urban heat island. The millions of people with our machines who are constantly producing heat, and the heat remains trapped between the tall buildings, which also block the wind. And the buildings themselves also absorb the solar radiation and radiate it out at night. So cities usually carry a bubble of hot air, which can be up to 7 or 8 degrees centigrade warmer inside the city than at the same time outside of the city. And it's not just hot air, it's also humid air, because people and their machines produce a lot of water vapor. So you have this bubble of warm, humid air, which over time, over the course of a day, will start rising up because it's warmer, and then starts meeting the cooler layers of the air above the city, and there the water in the water vapor in the air will start condensing and will start to form clouds. So some cities are so large that they create their own climate. And you can see that happening in this video. Is this series of satellite images taken over the course of one day over the city of Houston in Texas, USA. And you can see the time of the day at the bottom left corner. The city itself is not easy to see, but it's right in the middle of the screen. And as the day progresses, you see that clouds are forming only over the city center. And these are urban clouds producing urban rain in the evening. So that's an example of how the physics of the city is so different from the physics of the surrounding area. Another sound, noise. We produce a lot of sound together, and of course a lot of animals also use sound to communicate with each other. I showed the woodpecker already, but you can also think of frogs and insects. They all produce sound to communicate with each other, and the noise that we produce can interfere with that. And finally, a third example of the physics of the city that is different is the fact that we clothe the city always in impervious surfaces. We build roads and structures, buildings, of materials that are impenetrable to water. So concrete and glass and steel. Soils cannot form on these materials and plants cannot take root on them. And that immediately brings us to the second category of city life, namely fragmentation. Because of the fact that plants cannot grow everywhere in the city, the green areas in the city are very fragmented. This is a map of the green areas in London, and you see it's like an archipelago of green, of little islands, larger and littler islands of green, a very fragmented vegetation, which is not what you would normally find in a natural area. And if you would zoom in, this is a large scale, of course, but if you zoom in down to the scale of meters, you continue to see that fragmentation, that vegetation being reduced to patches here and there. A third category of ways in which the city is different is pollution. Whether we like it or not, and whether we try to reduce it or not, if you have millions of people being active together, we will produce a high concentration of various forms of pollution. This can be chemical pollution, but you can also think of the sound pollution that I mentioned before, or light pollution, or even other radiomagnetic waves produced by our phones, for example. Those are all forms of pollution that are much more concentrated in cities compared to natural environments. And the fourth category is new ecological relationships. This picture, which was taken in London, but it could also have been taken in many other European cities, shows a ringneck parakeet from India, which is feeding on the horse chestnut from Asia Minor. And on the leaves of the horse chestnut, you see the markings of the chestnut leaf miner, which is from Macedonia. So here you have a little ecosystem in the streets of London, composed entirely of species that are not native to London. They're not even native to the same part of the world. They've met each other and they've started interacting ecologically with each other because we have introduced them to each other, because of our economic activities. So the cities are places where, because of our economic activities, there's constantly exotic species being released or escaping, which start to form part of the food web of the city. So lots of species that have no history of interacting with each other are suddenly being introduced to each other. So these four categories, as I have described them, together combine what you could call an evolutionary landscape. It's a new environment full of opportunities and challenges that are new to the world, and that animals and plants will adapt to make use of the benefits and to be able to meet the challenges. And the sort of process that I'm thinking about, I would like to illustrate with a hypothetical example. And for that, I'd like to introduce this animal. This is the McFlurry hedgehog. It's a museum specimen from the Natural History Museum in Rotterdam. If you're ever in Rotterdam, you should really go and visit the Natural History Museum there. They have a wonderful display, which they call Dead Animal Tales. And it shows animals that have been taxidermied in exactly the same position in which they were found, which always involved a fatal interaction with us. And in the case of the McFlurry hedgehog, this animal was found dead with its head stuck in a McFlurry ice cream cup. Of course, these cups have they have a lid with a hole in it, and when these are littered, the hedgehogs will come and try to get to the leftover ice cream in the cup. But hedgehogs have spines which point backwards, so they can stick their head in, but then they cannot get it out anymore. So a lot of hedgehogs die because of starvation, or because they're blinded and they walk into the water or into the traffic. And in fact, you can on YouTube you can find many examples of hedgehogs that are walking around with a McFlurry ice cream cup or a different brand. This video shows a hedgehog with a different brand of ice cream cup stuck on its head, and this one is fortunately rescued by a passerby. Now, of course, you could imagine that here you have a situation that could be ready for evolutionary change, because there's a new resource, namely ice cream, which the hedgehogs could feed on. Perhaps they don't need their spines in the city. Perhaps the predators that the spines would defend them against are not present in the city. So you could imagine that a mutant hedgehog without any spines would be able to benefit from this new resource without running the risk that its head gets stuck in these cups. In fact, we do know, it's a hypothetical example, but we do actually have an example of a spineless hedgehog. This is a hedgehog an adult hedgehog that was found in England in a backyard without any spines. It was named Nelson. We don't know whether this is a genetic mutation, but if it is, then it could be that this is the starting point for an evolutionary change, because Nelson and its offspring, if they are also spineless, would enjoy the benefits of being able to eat the ice cream in the McFlurry cups and not have the disadvantage of getting their head stuck. So over time, because all the other hedgehogs would die because of the problems I just described, the ones with spines, over time, the whole population of urban hedgehogs could become spineless over many generations. And if this happens, if you get a change from a spined hedgehog to a spineless one in cities because of this advantage that they would get, we would call this human-induced rapid evolutionary change, or HIREC. And this actually is urban evolution. Again, I'm not saying that this particular process is happening with the hedgehogs. This is a hypothetical example, but in the rest of this talk, I'll give you a number of examples of real urban evolution, which proceeds along the same way that I have just described. Oh, and in case you're wondering what Nelson looks like if he rolls himself up into a ball, this is what you get. But let's go back now to those 4 categories that I mentioned before, and then I'll give you 1 or 2 examples for each of those categories of an animal or plant that has evolved because of these differences of cities compared to natural environments. And to begin with, the physics of the city. One animal that has adapted to the physics of the city is this lizard. This is Anolis cristatellus. It's a lizard from the Caribbean, and it lives on the island of Puerto Rico. And its natural niche there is to run around in the forest on branches chasing insects. That's what it's good at. That's what it's always been doing. But in recent years, or in recent decades, cities have appeared on Puerto Rico, large cities, and the lizards have colonized these cities, and there they try to do the same thing that they do in the forest, namely running around chasing insects. But of course, the surfaces that they run around on in the city is very different. They're much smoother surfaces. They're not rough bark of trees. They're mostly very smooth human-made surfaces like window ledges and roofs and fences and rain pipes. And their feet are not perfectly adapted to sticking on those very smooth surfaces. So you can see what happens in this video. Here you have an urban lizard trying to jump from a rain pipe to the edge of a roof, and its feet do not cling on properly, so it falls. And these are fairly large lizards, so they could break something, or they could even die when they fall. And that is your natural selection. That will remove from the population all the lizards whose feet are not as good at sticking on these smooth surfaces as the feet of other lizards. So you could imagine that the feet and legs of urban lizards are beginning to change as a result of the fact that they live in a different environment, a different physical environment. And somebody who's been studying this is Kristen Winchell. So what she did is she caught living lizards in 3 Puerto Rican cities and also in 3 forests outside of those cities. And she then subjected those lizards to a whole number of tests. So she took x-rays of them to measure the length of the bones in the legs. And she also put the feet of the lizards on a scanner so that she could measure the number of lamellae that they have under their toes. And this graph here shows her results. And it's a fairly complicated graph, so I will walk you through it very slowly. So what you see here is, first of all, you see gray boxes and you see white boxes. And the gray boxes are the measurements from the city, and the white boxes are the measurements from the forests. And each time you see 3 pairs of white and gray boxes because she had 3 cities and 3 forests. And on the left-hand side of the graph, you see the measurements for the rear legs. And on the right-hand side, you see the measurements for the front legs. And at the top, you see the length of the bones in the legs. And at the bottom, you see the number of lamellae that they have under their feet. And really, the only thing you need to notice is that the gray boxes are always higher than the corresponding white boxes. And this means that in cities overall on Puerto Rico with this lizard, the legs are longer than in the forest, and they have more lamellae under their feet than in the forest. So Kristen Winchell supposed that this may be the result of evolution of the urban lizards to a much smoother, more slippery surface, because these are basically parkour lizards, and every time they fall, you have a moment of natural selection. But she also did a number of experiments with live lizards to test her idea. So she built a ramp made out of very smooth tiles, which is under a 45-degree angle. You cannot see that in this video that I'm going to show because it was filmed perpendicular to the ramp. And then she chased urban and forest lizards up this ramp to see how well they were able to scale this this incline. So here you see what happens when an urban lizard climbs up this ramp. And you can see that it runs up very smoothly, very quickly. It doesn't seem to have any problems with the smooth surface. But if you do the same thing with a forest lizard, you can really tell that it has trouble with moving on this slippery surface. It's sliding back again, and it has to pause now and then. It clearly has more effort to climb up this ramp than the urban lizard. So that's an example of adaptation to the physics of the city. Now we go to the next category, this fragmentation, this island world of this archipelago of green islands that you find in the city. And of course, when you're talking about archipelagos and islands, you already think about evolution, because for example, the Galapagos Islands or Hawaii are examples of islands where evolution has proceeded in different directions on every island. And one city where you could study this would be New York. And this is a rather strange picture of New York, because on the right hand you see Manhattan as we know it, but on the left you see a kind of nature area. And that's because this picture was taken from a very nice project called the Manhattan Project, where researchers tried to recreate the environment of Manhattan more than 400 years ago, when it was first discovered by Europeans. So they've actually calculated the habitat that was present in Manhattan at that time, and they've created a kind of Google Earth interface, which you can where you can see the environment as it was 400 years ago, and you can make the modern day street plan appear. And you can even, that's the nice thing, you can even select a part of the city, for example, the part where you live, if you live in New York, and make the program behind the website calculate what probably would have been the flora and fauna that was living in that part of the city back 400 years ago, when the city was not built yet. And one of the species that you always find quite high on the list is the white-footed mouse. Now this is the white-footed mouse. It is not a domestic mouse. It's really a wild forest mouse, which occurs all over the east coast of North America. And it still also occurs in some of the larger parks in New York. Basically, it's living in those green islands, and it's not present in the areas in between. So a colleague of mine, Jason Munshi-South from Fordham University in New York, he has been studying these white-footed mice in the bigger city parks of New York to see whether they are evolving in different directions, because they've been isolated in those parks for more than 400 years already. And he has a very nice TED Ed lecture, of which I'd like to show a very short clip.
And this guy we catch in almost every forested area in New York City. This is the white-footed mouse. This is not the mouse you find running around your apartment. This is a native species, been here long before humans, and you find them in forests and meadows. Because they're so common in forested areas in the city, we're using them as a model to understand how species are adapting to urban environments. So if you think back 400 years ago, the 5 boroughs would have been covered in forest and other types of vegetation. This mouse would have been everywhere. Huge populations that showed few genetic differences across the landscape. But if you look at the situation today, they're just stuck in these little islands of forest scattered around the city. Just using 18 short segments of DNA, we can pretty much take a mouse, somebody could give us a mouse, not tell us where it was from, and we could determine what park it came from. That's how different they become.
So what he's saying here is that indeed those 400 years have been enough for changes, for evolution to take place in the DNA of these mouse populations that have been isolated in these different parks. And since this video was made, he's also discovered that those changes in the DNA are not random. They say something about the type of environment, the type of park that they live in. For example, in Central Park, which is the most heavily visited park in North America, he found that the mice have evolved a gene that allows them to deal with a very fatty diet. namely a human diet, because people leave, pizza crusts and French fries and peanuts in the park, and the mice feed on that. And of course, to them, it's just as unhealthy as it is to us, but they have had 400 mouse generations of time to adapt to this new food. So that's an example of evolution in a fragmented city. Now, the third category is pollution. And I mentioned there are various types of pollution, but here I'd like to talk about heavy metal pollution. And one animal that shows evolution as a result of heavy metals in the city is the common city pigeon. City pigeons are everywhere. They live all over the world. They live in cities everywhere. And of course, they drink water from puddles in the city. And we know that these puddles are often very polluted with heavy metals. In the past, there was a lot of lead from exhaust, from fuel. Now that's mostly been phased out, but there's still a lot of zinc in these puddles because of the zinc that is put on, for example, lampposts to stop them from corroding. And this has to do with an interesting pattern that was first discovered by a Russian scientist, Obukhova, who was looking at the distribution of gray and black pigeons all over Europe. Because as you probably know or have noticed, that these pigeons come in various color forms, and those are genetic color forms, just like the color of our hair or our eyes is genetic. So you have these light gray forms, and you also have these dark gray forms, which are almost black. And what she did was she mapped the distribution of these gray and black pigeons in many cities all over Europe. And she found out that if the larger a city was, the more you would have these melanic, these dark gray forms of pigeons. And she, at that time, this was about 20 years ago, couldn't really explain that. But since then, another scientist, Marion Chatelain from Paris, has been studying the reason or the cause for these darker pigeons in big cities. And she found out that these darker pigeons, the melanin, the pigment in their feathers binds to these heavy metals. So darker pigeons are better able to detox themselves from zinc and lead, because when they grow, they can put this heavy metal in their feathers, and there it is harmless. So that brings us to the final example of ways in which the city is different, namely these new ecological relationships. And I think one of the so you have to imagine that the city is really like the food web in the city is full of nodes with connecting points. So every node is a species, and a connection is some sort of ecological interaction with another species. Could be that they're feeding on that species, or that they're being eaten by that species, or that they compete with it. But we often forget that we, humans, are also an animal that lives in the city, and we are also in a very important node in that network. For example, this picture here of a lady feeding pigeons on the street is actually not that different from the video I showed at the beginning of a beetle that's being fed by ants. Just like these beetles have evolved the ability to trick the ants into feeding them, to sharing their food with them, a different species. Somehow pigeons have also evolved the ability to make use of our social system, to parasitize on our social system, to make us share our food with them. And it turns out that this close interaction with people, especially in birds and mammals, is changing the personality of these animals, and it's changing them in an evolutionary way. They're the genetic differences which cause different personalities. And when I talk about personality, I mean things like problem-solving ability. Now, you could imagine that problem-solving is something that in a natural environment is not that important. If you're living in a stable forest and you're feeding on a particular type of seed, for example, then the way you open that seed is going to work for thousands of years. You're not going to meet new seeds every year. But in cities, this might be different. In cities, birds may be feeding on human food, so it might be very advantageous for them to quickly be able to figure out whether something can be opened and if there is food in it, because humans package their food in different ways every few years. So problem-solving ability is maybe in cities very important for birds. Now, this has been studied in a number of cases. For example, in this bird, which is the Barbados bullfinch. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. The Barbados bullfinch is a bird that lives on the island of Barbados. It lives both in the city there and also in the countryside. And there was a group of students, Canadian students, who went to Barbados to study the problem-solving ability of these Barbados bullfinches. And because they noticed that they were in the cities, they were very clever at opening these sugar packages on restaurant tables. So what they did is they caught 30 finches in the city and also 30 finches in the countryside. And they all presented them, they put them in cages and they presented them with a so-called puzzle box, which is a little contraption made by the students themselves, which the birds had never seen before, which required 2 or more manipulations to get to the food inside. So in this case, they presented the birds with a puzzle box that required them to pull something out and then to pry a lid off a little box to get to the seeds inside. And here you see an urban bullfinch that is for the first time meeting this puzzle box. So you see it immediately figures out you have to pull something out. It looks at it for a few seconds and then sees you can take that lid off. And when you've taken it off, you nicely put it to the side, and then you can get to the food inside. Now these urban bullfinches, they could all do this, and they could all do it within a minute. But the rural bullfinches from outside of the city, same species, half of them couldn't do it at all, and the other half took much longer than the urban bullfinches. So that's an example of a personality trait, namely problem-solving ability, that seems to be changing, perhaps evolving in urban birds because of this close interaction with us, with humans. Now, of course, all the examples that I've shown you so far are very subtle examples. They're very small changes, very small evolutionary changes into one particular aspect of the species. We don't see completely new species appearing. We don't yet see these species like myrmecophiles that are completely different from their relatives and that are only living in cities. You don't really expect that also, because ants' nests have been around for tens of millions of years. Cities have only been around for a few thousand years. So there has not been enough time for big evolutionary steps. But there are 1 or 2 exceptions. There are 1 or 2 species in cities that are really on the way to become separate species. And one of them is the blackbird. The blackbird is one of the birds that was first to colonize cities. And when you compare blackbirds in cities with blackbirds in forests, you see that there's not just one difference. There's a whole list of ways in which the blackbirds in cities are different from blackbirds in forests. So in cities, they have shorter beaks. They sing at a higher pitch. They sing at a different time of the day. They breed much earlier in the year. They don't migrate anymore. They have a more relaxed personality. That's something you can actually measure and something that you can trace back to a mutation in the DNA for a gene that is a receptor for serotonin, which is a hormone. So because of this, also because of the different breeding times and the fact that they don't migrate anymore, you see also that there's not so much interbreeding anymore between the urban blackbirds and the forest blackbirds. So they're really on the way of becoming a new species. They're definitely not there yet. It's very early in the process, but it could be that if cities are going to be with us for many more centuries, that in a few hundred years, we will actually find 2 blackbirds in the bird guides, the urban blackbird and the original forest blackbird. Now, of course, I'm very excited about evolution in the city. We can study it where we live. You don't have to go far away. But more importantly, we can also involve the general public. The cities, by definition, are full of people which could start working also on solving evolutionary problems in the city. So, for example, we've set up a nice project here in the Netherlands, which we call Evoscope, where we have where we involve the general public into studying the ways in which animals are changing in cities. And we've used these garden snails to in an app which we call Snail Snap, which allows people to take pictures of garden snails. And we've shown that the different color types of the garden snail are changing in cities. In cities, they are lighter. They're more yellow, and they have overall they are lighter colored, and that probably has to do with the urban heat islands, because the lighter shells are better at reflecting the heat of the sun, so they're less prone to overheating. And we know that in the cities it's hotter, so there's more need for these snails to be protected against overheating. Another thing you can do with citizen scientists in the city is to involve them in discovering the biodiversity that is in cities. I mentioned before that cities are really rich in animals and plants, much richer than many people realize. So some of the expeditions that so for many years I was organizing expeditions for citizen scientists in the jungles of Borneo, but in the last few years I've started taking them just to the park in the city where they live and really discovering new species there, really teaching people how they can study the undiscovered life forms that live really in their own neighborhood. And finally, I think you can also use this evolutionary knowledge to build more nature inclusive cities. For example, there's now a trend, of course, to have green facades and green roofs. And often architects, they simply pick plants from the catalog of a garden center and plant those on those walls and on those roofs. But the city is full of wild plants, which are in the process of evolving to become perfect urban species. So actually, I think it's better to take an example from walls that are naturally vegetated in the city, like this one in Calcutta in India, which is covered in vegetation that was not planted by any designer. It just grows there naturally. And instead, architects of new buildings could just offer the space for these plants to grow on rather than planting them, and just allow the species that are present in the city naturally to colonize these green facades and to build a green facade from species that are already present in the city and that are the perfect urban inhabitants. Well, with that, I'd like to end this talk. It's been great fun presenting to you all. As Elena has said, there is a book, Darwin Grode, if I pronounce it properly, thank you, in now available in Russia. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Menno. And I'm glad to tell you that actually at least two of our audience have already bought the book while you were speaking.
While I was speaking. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, so the promotion worked. Now we proceed to the questions. So the Q&A session has started. And the first question was about the beetles. And you mentioned the relationship between male beetles and female beetles. And Ksenia Borisova asks whether or not the beetles find each other using like a scent or something like that, because the bottle doesn't smell like a female beetle. So what happened in there?
Yeah, that's a good question indeed. Usually insects use various cues to recognize their partners and to select their partners, and scent and molecules are usually an important part of that. But in this beetle, it seems that sort of more visual and touch cues from vision and touch are maybe more important than pheromones. So they are attracted, it seems, to the gloss, to the color of the bottles, which apparently is very similar to the color of the females. And once they are there, then they realize how big this bottle is, and that it also has, you know, the right pattern, the tactile pattern on the glass. Even though, yeah, obviously it doesn't smell like a female, but apparently those other stimuluses are just stronger than the ones that are of the pheromones that are lacking. So, but it's a good question. But it seems that in this particular species, the scent is not as important as you would expect.
Thank you. So the next question, and I remind everyone that you can ask your questions either in the chat or in Q&A mode. So the next question comes from, if I pronounce correctly, Soham Ray. So he says that he found it very interesting about the news about adaptation of species to urban environments. But what about corvus species like crows or magpies? Do you think that they are affected negatively like vultures and pigeons, or they were positively affected like bullfinches and blackbirds? What could be the reasons that you could think of that they are more successful in adaptations everywhere around the world?
Yeah, a good point. We do indeed we see that. So what I've explained is that some species adapt to cities; they change genetically. But of course, there are also species that that are what we call pre-adapted. So their natural niche is somewhat similar to the niche that we are creating in cities. Pigeons are a good example because their natural environment is actually rocky cliffs. That's where pigeons in the wild are nesting and feeding. And in our cities, we're actually producing artificial cliffs. Our buildings, to them, are actually not that different from their natural environment. And that's why they do so well in the city center. And the same thing is true for corvids. For many species of crows, in nature, they live in a very dynamic environment, an environment that is constantly changing. And that is also an aspect that is very similar in cities. Cities are not stable, they're constantly changing. And many crows are able to deal with that very well. But still, I think also some crows are evolving after they colonize a city. And in my book, I give an example of crows in Japan that have either learned or evolved the ability to make use of traffic to crack nuts, which is a behavior that has started first in Japan and is now also seen in Europe, of carrion crows that are using traffic as giant nutcrackers, basically. But I definitely think that corvids, so crows and jays and magpies, they're wonderful birds to study in an urban environment.
Okay, so the next question comes from Ksenia Avilova. She mentions that there was little mentioned about the light pollution, and it has a huge impact on animals, on flora and fauna. And do you have any examples of a species adaptation to that?
Very good point. There is, I think I agree that light pollution is often underestimated as an impact on wildlife, especially insects, of course. So, for millions of years, the moon and the stars were the only light at night, and almost all nocturnal animals were adapted to using just the moon and the stars. And then suddenly, 150 years ago, we started producing artificial light at night. So you see that insects which, for example, an insect 200 years ago, if it wanted to fly in a straight line at night, it simply needed to keep a fixed angle with the moon, and then it would fly nicely in a straight line. But if that moon suddenly is a street lantern, which is much closer, then you cannot use it as a way to fly in a straight line anymore, because if you keep a fixed angle with the street lantern, you end up flying in circles around it. And that's what's happening to many insects. And that's not good for them, because they will die because of the heat of the light, or they are just wasting time that they should have spent looking for food or for mates. And surprisingly, very few people have studied the evolutionary effects of artificial light. There's only one example of that I know of a moth that has been studied in Switzerland, where it was shown that the city population of the moth was more resistant to artificial light. So it was less distracted by light than a population of the same moth from the forest, which indeed suggests that this artificial light in cities is changing the genetics of the insects to make them less likely to be attracted to the light. But it's only been studied on one insect so far, and I'm sure it's something that is affecting thousands of species of insects.
Okay, and so continuing this topic, so Xenia Borisova asks that she tells that a lot of examples that you used these are the examples of adaptation, but if we imagine that people and cities just disappear, like it was many thousands years ago, do you think that all these adaptations will just go away? Because well, okay, I think.
No, indeed, it's possible that some urban animals and plants are already so strongly adapted to the urban environment that if you would place them back in their original niche in a wild environment, they would not be able to survive, or at least they will not be able to compete with the wild relatives of the same species. So at the moment, I think for almost all urban species, there is still also a wild population. So you have urban pigeons, but we also still have the ancestors living in natural environments. But there are a few exceptions. For example, there's the house crow, which is a corvid. We talked about corvids earlier. That's a species that has disappeared from wild environments. It's only living in cities. And also the house sparrow, I think, is also an example. You almost cannot find wild house sparrows in natural environments. They always live close to people. So if people would go extinct, then I think some of these species that have become completely adapted to us would probably go extinct as well.
And a question from Daria Sherbunova, again, to continue this topic, how low or how high are the chances for complete extinction of the species that are less adapt to competition? For example, if we speak about some suburban species, how are they going to compete with those of urban species?
Well, I think it depends very much on the type of animal or plant that you're talking about. Because if you have let's say if you have a very large city stretching, 40 or 50 kilometers, and if you have a species that has very low mobility, like some insects or snails, then you could imagine that some populations that are living in the center are adapted to the city center, and other populations that are living in the suburbs are living to suburban conditions. Because of course we talk about the city as if it is a single uniform environment, but it isn't, like your questioner mentioned. The suburbs are very different ecologically compared to the city center. So for an animal or plant that is not able to move very far, they can adapt locally, even to within a city, to different conditions. But if you're talking about a bird or a butterfly that flies long distances, then it could be that an animal that is adapted to the city center will not be able to survive in the suburbs, and vice versa. So it's quite complex. It depends on the animal or plant that you're talking about.
Okay, and a question from Yekaterina Pilutina. Do you feel in the cities where you work with other specialists or by yourself, do you feel the need, the support and the interest of citizens that you work with to the project and to the study of the species themselves in the urban species? I mean,
I noticed that we work quite a lot with citizen scientists or community scientists, and my impression is that people are usually their eyes, when you open their eyes for the complexity of the ecosystem that they're living in, even in a city, then they start to appreciate their urban environment more. In some cities are so large that many people in the city, they don't come in natural environments at all anymore. They're spending 100% of their time in the city, or at least in an urbanized environment, and they may think that nature doesn't exist anymore where they live. But when you start to realize that you're actually living inside a new ecosystem that we have created, which is full of species, but many people don't see them, or they just see one or two of them, or even if they see them, they don't realize that they see them. But once your eyes are open to that, and also open to the fact that this ecosystem is evolving while we are watching it, I think that can make, and I notice already that people are becoming more appreciative of their natural environment in the city.
Okay, and could you give some recommendations on how to make cities more convenient to be inhabited by living creatures, where there should be none, as the animals and insects will adapt themselves? It's a question from Fyodor Kuryavtsov.
Yeah, there are, of course, many animals and plants can adapt to the city, but also many cannot. So what I've given you in my talk are a number of the success stories of species that have been successfully able to change genetically and to evolve to adapt to the city. But for every success story, there are probably many species that go extinct in cities simply because they cannot adapt quickly enough. So they disappear. But even the species that can adapt, we can enhance that process, I think, by in several ways. One I think is to allow more what you could call naturalness in the city, and that usually means making the city less tidy. It's of course, especially in the Netherlands, we're an extremely tidy country. The municipalities, they will not allow any wild plants growing on the pavement, or any vacant lots to stay vacant for very long. Whereas, or dead leaves are constantly being swept up. But a lot of species, and especially smaller species, insects and mosses and lichens and spiders, they can survive in very small spaces, but they will need dead leaves or weeds or any form of naturalness in the city. So if we can allow ourselves to be a little bit less tidy, I think that's going to help a lot. And another way is to look more at the city, at the scale of the animals and plants that we're talking about. And as I mentioned, many of those are much smaller than we think. We notice the birds and the squirrels, but most urban animals are small insects of 2 or 3 millimeters, which we don't see, or at least I see them, but many people don't see them. And they can survive, in a square meter of vegetation. So just be aware that species are living on your roof, and in a patch of soil around a tree on a street, which is just half a square meter. So those places are important for many species that are too small for us to notice.
Yeah, that's actually a problem for Moscow, because leaves are being removed everywhere, and no, like an inch of free territory remains free for a long time. So yeah, that's a very interesting insight. So another question comes from loads of people, and Olga Begavatova is interested in possibilities of urban planning for wildlife and bird-inclusive cities. Maybe you are familiar with international achievements experience in this field. So could you please name some, if you are?
Could you just repeat the last bit? I just missed you for a second there.
Maybe you are familiar with international achievements experience in this field of urban planning for wildlife and bird-inclusive cities.
Right. There are various strategies that cities all over the world are employing to increase the wildlife in cities. They usually have to do with increasing connectivity, as they call it, to connect fragments. The fragments that I mentioned, for example, there's usually a trend in green planning in cities to try to connect those isolated parks, or to create corridors from the natural environment around the city into the city center. For example, Amsterdam is doing that by creating sort of highways of vegetation that is connected, that goes from the city edge right into the center. these things are, I guess they are important, but they tend to focus on the effects on larger animals. So birds and mammals, they will benefit from those connectivities. For smaller organisms like insects, they usually are not negatively affected by the fact that green areas in the city are fragmented, because as I mentioned, many insects can, to them, a few square meters is already a whole continent. So something that looks like a small isolated park to us, for many insects, is large enough to survive for many generations. Although for some insects, that's not true. Larger, like butterflies, dragonflies, larger bees, the very mobile insects, for them it's also important to connect city parks with each other. So I think generally this is the only international trend that I noticed that is being adopted by many cities worldwide.
Okay, thank you. And is there a connection between evolutionary or adaptive changes in animals and plants due to climate changes versus those which were made due to urbanization?
Yeah, there is actually the example that I mentioned at the end, which the citizen science project we did on the snails, where we showed that the snails in the urban heat island are lighter colored. That is actually sort of an evolution that is coming on top of the evolution that we are already seeing because of climate change. So we see that if you look, the nice thing with these snails is that we have old collections, so you can actually look at the older specimens that were collected 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and you can see that because of climate change, they have evolved in the whole country, or actually all over Europe, from darker to lighter. But that effect is enhanced in the cities, because there, on top of the normal climate change, you have this urban heat island. So there they are extra light.
Okay, and could you please maybe you have some interesting examples of fish that lives in, I mean, fishes, different types of fish that live in water in cities like lakes or ponds or maybe rivers. Do you have any? No, yeah.
Yeah, in my book there's a couple of examples of fish that have adapted to very strong chemical pollution. I didn't mention that in the talk, but there are several examples. One of them involves a small freshwater fish called the mummy chog, which is a North American species. And there are examples of this species being able to withstand levels of pollution with PCBs, which are like thousands of times higher than what this fish normally can survive. And this fish have been studied biochemically. It turns out that they have, because PCBs normally they cause developmental defects, so the embryo is deformed, and that has to do with a whole chain reaction of hormones in the developing fish or human. But it turns out that this fish has really sort of removed certain molecules from certain proteins from this whole developmental pathway to be able to develop, even though they are surrounded by these lethal concentrations of PCBs. And different populations of the same fish species have done this in different ways in different places. So we see the same sort of evolutionary solution, or actually different evolutionary solutions to the same problem. And they all result in the fact that these fish can survive in places where they shouldn't be able to survive. But
Okay.
again, I should mention this is an example of a fish that can do that, but many other fishes or other animals have gone extinct because of the pollution. That not everybody can adapt.
And are street cats and house cat, I mean, those who are pets, are an example of urban-driven of evolution? Because we know that cats used to be wild, and but actually nowadays a lot of people try to pet some wild cats like jaguars or lynxes or some other wild cats.
Not sure if I understand the question correctly.
So are street cats and house pets an example of urban-driven evolution? So
well, they're a good example of domestication, and domestication is a special kind of urban evolution, you could say, because it's evolution. It's a genetic change in this species because of the environment that they live in. Partly it is artificial selection. Of course, we have been selecting certain characteristics in house cats for many centuries. But in addition, also they have evolved in characteristics which we have not consciously selected. But the interesting thing is, I'm not sure if that is the answer that this question asker is looking for. But the interesting thing to me is that we see that, for example, foxes that live in an urban environment are showing the same sort of changes in their skull that dogs are showing compared to wolves. So it seems that this close interaction with humans in a wild species also causes changes which resemble the changes we're finding in domesticated animals. And of course, there's a number of very interesting Russian studies on the evolution of domestication. That there's another book about that, which you probably know, how to tame a fox and build a dog, I think it's called.
Yeah, great. And I think the last question for today, because I was actually going to ask it myself, but Ksenia Borisova asked it for me.
Okay.
About Homo sapiens, actually, about us people. So of course we know that every Homo sapiens used to be another type of Homo type, so to say, and of course we adapted to city lives, and we live in big cities, etc. And can you? I'll rephrase the question a bit. Can you maybe predict how we as a species will change in, let's say, 100 years? Because there are a lot of jokes that people will be walking like that because we are in our gadgets all the time. So do you have any predictions, or maybe there are studies that you are going to conduct on it?
Yeah. Well, I think when we think about human evolution, we usually think about posture and intelligence, but of course there's also a lot of evolution going on that is not visible. And one type of evolution that we actually have evidence for that has affected humans because of urbanization is the way our immune system works. There are studies from the very earliest cities in the Middle East, from skeletons of a few thousand years ago that were living in the early cities, which show that the genes involved in the immune system are very different from people living at the same time in more rural conditions, probably because infectious diseases are so much more easily transmitted in these densely populated cities. And of course, with the recent COVID pandemic, we've seen the same thing. These viruses or other pathogens are affecting us very differently in populations that are living very closely together, like in cities, compared to places where people are living much more further apart. So I think the evolutionary changes, the most important ones, they're maybe not the most spectacular ones, but probably the most important ones, are in a few hundred years, are going to be the ones that affect the way our body deals with infections, because I think infectious diseases are going to be even more frequent than they already are in these larger and larger cities that we're getting.
Okay, thank you so much. So with this question, we're going to wrap up this conversation. Thank you so much, Menno, for this incredibly interesting talk, and thank you for all of our audience for asking questions, for being with us. There are so many of you today, which we are very happy about. And for those of you who would like to watch this lecture again, we will be sending a letter with the recording of this lecture. Unfortunately, it's only in English due to technicalities, but you will be able to rewatch it again. And thank you for being with us, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.